All right. Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today again. It's another fireside chat today with Dr. Ben Bikman, or Ben. He just told me I can call him throughout this video. Ben is a metabolic scientist. He is the founder of HLTH Code, one of my favorite keto meal replacement shakes. And Ben has a wealth of information when it comes to metabolism, and in particular also fat metabolism. And so today I want to talk to Ben about, some of the challenges, some of the factors involved in why the body accumulates fat, what you can do to lose that fat, what are some of the strategies that are probably not going to work, and what are some of the strategies that you can try out if you're maybe stuck with stubborn areas on your body that you can't seem to get rid of. And so we talk about the hormones involved, how the body decides to store fat in the first place, and all of the things that go along. And my hope is that at the end of this video, you'll have a good idea, or maybe some ideas that you can execute and leverage to, get rid of some of the fats and to maybe improve your body composition and hopefully your health in the long run. Because I believe that, losing fat is a byproduct of a healthy dietary lifestyle. And so it shouldn't really be a main focus and something you should get stressed about, but really something that you'll see, when you live a human when you have a species appropriate diet for humans. We'll talk about what that means maybe a little bit, some of the foods that you should and should not be eating. And yeah, with that, I'm going to hand it over to you. Maybe, introduce yourself a little bit, tell us a little bit more about who you are, what you do, and why you're interested in metabolism in particular. And then we'll talk about some of those topics. And at the end, we'll tell everyone how people can find you. We're going to talk about your book, your meal replacement drink, and everything that goes along with it.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Well, Michael, thanks again. This is fun for me. Yeah. So I am a professor and a scientist. As a professor, I teach two classes, both relevant even to this conversation. I teach a class called pathophysiology, which is when the systems of the body aren't working well. And I teach in a graduate class in endocrinology, so the study of hormones in the body. And then as a scientist, I'm the director of the diabetes lab here at BYU. And my lab really focuses quite heavily on the origins and progression of metabolic disarray within a cell and tissue. And so we focus a lot on mitochondrial physiology. We focus on the hormones that play a role in disrupting these processes, most especially insulin. That is the focus, just because insulin has such a heavy hand in controlling metabolic function. And so in that role, I mentor students, graduate students, and we're doing work in those topics all the time. So all the topics that we're going to discuss today, because they all have such a metabolic theme to them, they're ones that I'm comfortable addressing. And I think it's going to end up being a great conversation.
Cool. Very nice. So maybe let's start with a couple of basics for all of those who don't really know much about metabolism. How does the body work in terms of, using the food that we eat for energy? What different types of fuel are there? Carbs and fat.
Yeah.
And how do those, how does everything work? And then at what point does the body decide, well, I can actually accumulate fat? Why do we have that capability? Why do we grow fat in the first place? What's the point?
Yeah. So that's a lot right there, which is a fun place to start. Yeah, but it's great. So what we need to keep in mind at the outset is there's a difference between the nutrient we're eating versus the fuel that's in the blood. So when we are eating fat, of course, that fat can become a fuel in the body. When we eat carbohydrate, that carbohydrate turns into a fuel, namely glucose. Then there are other fuels in the body that we don't eat, but the body makes. And that is lactate and ketones. Ketones are one that we all know. Your whole group knows what ketones are. Few people appreciate that lactate is also a fuel. Not only is it the main source of gluconeogenesis, so when we start fasting or go into a low-carb diet, the fact that our glucose levels stay normal and don't start dropping is because the liver starts taking lactate from the muscle and turns it into glucose. So it is converting this lactate into glucose, but also the lactate itself is a fuel that can fuel the brain. much like ketones, although not nearly to that same degree. But lactate and ketones have a caloric value to them, and thus they are a fuel, because you'd asked about fuel. Now, these are all calories, and of course we have a caloric centric view of obesity and body weight, body fat changes. You know, on it, culturally speaking, if the average individual goes to some expert dietitian or their clinician and they say, "Oh, I'm overweight, I'd like to lose weight," the expert is going to say you need to eat less and exercise more, because they have totally embraced that kind of thermodynamics view of body fat regulation. You just simply need to push the caloric balance to the side of using more than is coming in, and voila, it's simple, you will lose weight. That's complicated though, because the more you have a weight loss strategy that is based on depriving the body of fuel, the more the brain is sensing that deprivation and will stimulate hunger. As an example, if we were all going to a dinner and the host of this dinner told us all that they have invited the world's most famous chefs and they're going to have the most delicious food, and that we should come as hungry as possible to ensure that we can eat as much of this variety of food as we can, we would probably do two things in the days preceding this event. We would start exercising a little harder in the day or two before we go, and we would start eating less, all in an effort to make sure we came to that party as hungry as possible.
Right.
But I know we can all see the problem with that already. Those two things that we're doing to make sure we go to the party as hungry as possible are the two things that we've been telling people for 50 or 60 years that they should do in order to lose weight. And yes, you will lose weight, at least in the short term, but you have now initiated a series of events that are going to make you increasingly hungry. And hunger always wins. And thus, if someone is trying to address body fat by focusing strictly on energy, on fuel, they will lose. Hunger will win. Now, this isn't me saying calories don't matter. I'm not saying that. A lot of people want to think I am. I'm not saying that. Calories do matter. But if your focus is strictly on cutting calories alone, then you're going to start cutting things like fats, which are more calorically dense, and you're going to start getting hungrier. Now, however, if we take a step away, if we put the calories to the side, and we appreciate that humans are more complicated than a simple machine. We're more complicated than the engine driving our car. That we have more variety in what the body can do with energy and more inputs that dictate what's happening. It's more than just pressing on the accelerator to expend more energy and controlling exactly how much fuel is going into the gas tank. Then we realize that the body, a cell does not inherently know what to do with the energy that it has around it. And by that, I mean, there must be a hormone signal of some kind that is telling the cells of the body what to do with the energy that it has. And among these hormone signals, insulin absolutely, unapologetically reigns supreme. Insulin is so powerful at signaling fuel storage that there are multiple other hormones that have to work in concert to try to offset what insulin alone is capable of doing. And just to be a little more explicit about it, where insulin is signaling the fat cells of the body to store energy, there are about 5 or 6 other hormones that have to work against that signal, like epinephrine, norepinephrine, glucagon, growth hormone, even cortisol. All of these hormones, to a degree, cortisol, all of these hormones have to work against insulin. It takes a little army because insulin is so capable. But just to really put a fine point on this, across the hallway in my laboratory here on campus, we are growing fat cells in a little petri dish, like typical science. We're growing these fat cells. And these fat cells are swimming in a little culture medium, we call it. It's a cell culture medium, or like a little bath. And in that bath, we have a bunch of energy. We have calories in the form of glucose and fats. Interestingly, even though there are thousands of calories of fuel surrounding these fat cells, the fat cells aren't growing at all. They will not grow. They don't know what to do with that energy. But the moment we start putting insulin into that bath, then they start to know, they know what to do now. They start pulling in the energy and storing it as fat droplet, as what we call a lipid droplet, which is just triglycerides all stuck together. And now the cell knows what to do. But that's what's so important in our understanding of obesity and weight gain or weight loss. It is both that insulin and calories matter. Absolutely. Because insulin will signal the fat cell to grow, but the fat cell can't grow unless there's sufficient energy or calories in order to turn it into fat. And so both of these paradigms are valid, but my view is very firmly that we should start a weight loss journey with low insulin. So we aren't forcing hunger. We basically tell the person, control your carbohydrates, prioritize protein, and don't fear fat. That'll be a way to make sure that you are getting proper nourishment to your body, and yet you are lowering insulin. And by keeping insulin low, a fat cell has no choice. It must be giving out more fat than it's taking in, and thus the fat cell will start to shrink. And that allows the body to become increasingly accustomed to using its own fat for fuel. And thus, when the time comes for the weight loss journey which has been low insulin based, to also now start doing kind of lower calorie through, say, fasting protocols, now the body can transition into that reduced energy state by using its own energy, because that's what fat cells are. Even the average lean person has hundreds of thousands of calories stored as fat on their body. They just can't use it because their chronically elevated insulin levels won't let them.
Right. So in other words, if you start with a ketogenic diet to fix a chronically high insulin, and then you add in fasting, then or a caloric deficit, you don't really have a caloric deficit as soon as your body has learned to use its own fat for fuel, right? Even though you eat less, you get the fuel that you need. Right.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. Especially the brain, because the brain is what's going to initiate the hunger signal. And the unique thing about the brain is that it has no capacity to store its own energy. Muscle has a certain amount of fat and glycogen stored in it. The liver has lots of fats and lots of glycogen stored in it. Fat cells, of course, have a lot of fat stored. And thus, if energy stopped coming in, even in the immediate, let alone longer term, they're fine. They have energy that they can be relying on to fuel themselves. The brain does not have that freedom, doesn't have that ability to lean on its own energy. It must constantly be getting energy from the blood. And thus, when insulin is high, we know this. David Ludwig at Harvard published a fascinating paper on this. When insulin goes up, the overall amount of available energy in the blood goes down. And this is why when insulin is spiked, hunger comes up much more quickly. In contrast, when insulin is low, the body is now moving energy around rather than just storing it. And thus the overall energy availability is higher. And that is why hunger is diminished. Satiety is higher as a result. And so to your point, if we are training our body to use its own fat and we're burning fat and that fat's turning into ketones and that's making sure the brain isn't going hungry, well then if the brain's getting enough energy, it assumes the body is getting enough energy, rightly so, and thus hunger is turned off.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, that seems to be a fairly easy fix. Are there cases where that strategy might not work for some people? Or let's say, I've met a couple of, athletes while working out, and as I said before, and before we started the recording, in particular, women seem to have issues with it, where there are certain areas of their body, despite the ketogenic diet, despite the fasting, despite the exercise, despite the eating right, quote unquote, there are some areas that don't seem to change much. They thin out everywhere else, but maybe thighs, belly, what have you, doesn't change. Yeah. What is causing that?
Yeah, this brings up a new character in this whole conversation, which is an enzyme called lipoprotein lipase. And lipoprotein lipase is very relevant to fat storage, amount and location. And it is generally a combination of genetics and insulin. Insulin will increase the expression of lipoprotein lipase in fat cells. And where we have more lipoprotein lipase is where we will store more fat, because lipoprotein lipase is responsible, I'm just going to call it LPL. LPL is responsible for pulling fats in from the blood and then putting it into a cell for storage. So wherever we have more LPL expression in our blood vessels, that's just a site that's always going to be pulling in more fat. And that is not only does that partly explain why some people naturally have a little more fat and have a harder time controlling fat than other people, it is a differential expression of LPL, which again is somewhat genetic and somewhat diet-based, but also sex heavily determines that, because sex hormones will determine largely where LPL gets expressed. And that is why a little boy and a little girl look the same. Their body is indistinguishable from each other other than their sex organs. Their body looks the same. But the moment they start to go through puberty, their sex hormone differences start dictating where the body starts storing fat. And now the boy, testosterone doesn't really induce fat storage anywhere, a little bit in the visceral abdominal space. But the estrogens, not that it induces it, it just increases LPL expression in those locations. Of course, estrogens powerfully induce LPL expression on the breasts and hips and buttocks, which is why the little girl starts to look like a woman. She starts looking more and more like mom did.
Right.
That is entirely due to LPL expression. But to a similar degree, genetically, you may have a woman who has a lot of LPL expression on her triceps, or a lot of LPL expression on her ankles. So her ankles will just store more fat. Or in some rare instances, she may have a version of a disorder called lipodystrophy. And this is very, very obvious, where a woman will have almost no body fat on her upper body whatsoever, exceptionally lean all the way down to her waist. And then from her waist and down has much, much more fat on her buttocks, thighs, and all the way down to her feet. That is a form of lipodystrophy where she doesn't have any lipoprotein lipase on her upper body and only has it on her lower body. That's not common, but I bet everyone who's listening can think, oh yeah, I've seen someone like this. Yeah. It's common enough that you would have seen it, but the average woman will not have this. The average person, however, will have some site of preferential fat storage. For guys like you and I, that's typically just going to be right around our waist. Like we're typically, if we're going to get fat anywhere, that's where it's going to be. And when we start losing fat, that'll be the last place it comes from. Every body has some place or two that's just like that. So if there's a woman who is frustrated that she stores fat on her lower legs, like around her ankles or so, that will literally be the last place her fat would start coming from. For some reason, where that body is expressing more lipoprotein lipase, that's essentially the site where the fat is defending itself the longest and the hardest. And the fat will have to have come from everywhere else before it starts coming from there. That's just one of the kind of sad realities / quirks of fat storage.
So some might think then I'm just going to suck it off. Liposuction or sculpting, or I don't know what else is out there. What is your take on that? Is it effective? So it is effective at reducing fat storage in that particular spot. There's no doubt about it. However, what tends to happen is that there's a rebound fat storage somewhere else. That is, you have stripped the body of its preferential fat storage site, it just picks a new one. Right. And I think evolutionarily speaking, storing fat is a way for the body to make sure there is food or there is energy when there is no food, right? Because now we can go to the fridge and eat, but back in the days, you don't know when the next hunt was successful. So you needed something like your own fridge, basically, to have energy and to not die, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and even more than that. So absolutely, it's metabolic insurance that we once upon a time needed before we lived in this culture of such excess. We needed to know that the body needed to have that, to rely on that. But it is so important, that metabolic reservoir, that it is absolutely essential to the reproduction of our entire species. Few people realize this, but the fat-derived hormone leptin is the signal that initiates adolescence or puberty. That it is the signal that lights the brain up and tells the brain it's time to sexually develop. And now the brain starts sending hormone signals down to the gonads, to the ovaries and the testes, to tell them to start undergoing sexual maturation. And then maturation begins, and then the body becomes reproductive or capable of reproduction. But it only happens when there's a leptin signal from the fat cells. And this is why, if especially in women who have to, this is much more sensitive in women than it is in men. Men can have exceptionally low fat levels and low leptin levels and still have normal reproductive capability, normal fertility, because men don't bear the metabolic burden of reproduction.
Right.
We have our moment and it's glorious and we're done. With women, they have the metabolic burden of gestating, growing that little baby. And so she has to make sure that she has enough energy that if her food intake became compromised, she still has enough energy stored as fat on her body to give to the baby growing in her to help the baby grow. And not only to grow to full gestation, but also to feed the baby through lactation once the baby is born. So
Right.
a female body is much more sensitive to the leptin signal from fat cells, and she needs much more fat than a man does. She's designed that way. It's supposed to happen. Women are supposed to have more fat than men, and they are healthier with more fat than men because of how and where they store it.
Right.
And thus, it's certainly a point of consideration when women are upset. And I get it. You know, I'm a guy, so what do I know, right? But I can understand. But it's always
Right.
important to just help all of us remember that we have to have fat. It is essential for the survival of the species, and we are literally designed to only be fertile if we have enough fat.
Right. And, you know, if I look at pictures or videos or whatever of, you know, maybe native tribes or maybe some of the, you know, still remaining hunter-gatherer tribes, you know, the men are typically, you know, skinny and ripped, but, you know, women, not so much. They carry around a little bit more. And, you know, and that's probably not because of their crappy diet, you know.
They're literally built that way. Indeed, the hormone progesterone is a fattening hormone. It will stimulate hunger and it will stimulate fat storage. So a woman can even notice this. Presumably, I'm not a woman. I don't have any firsthand experience with this, but it's documented that during a menstrual cycle, when progesterone is up during that kind of menstrual phase, a woman will have greater hunger.
Right.
And that's because progesterone is working with insulin to push nutrients into fat cells, and thus available nutrients in the blood goes down. The brain is sensing that and says, hey, we got to top that back up. We need to eat.
Right.
We need to eat.
That makes sense. I can definitely confirm that from my wife. She always says
don't tell her that.
No, she's very much aware and okay with that. But that brings up two more interesting points. One, I saw you mentioned on I think on an Instagram video, and that is keto diet while being pregnant or nursing, right? Especially while nursing. I think.
Not pregnant, but nursing. Yeah.
And
so
the
that's
second one. Yeah, let's talk about that maybe for.
Yeah, sure. So it was just my wanting to be sort of honest in fully disclosing the fact that there are published medical case reports of lactating women, breastfeeding women who are adhering to a ketogenic diet and get into genuine ketoacidosis. I would not have shown that video, and a lot of people have really been upset about it, as if I'm somehow trying to attack a ketogenic diet. Far from it. It is just highlighting the fact that lactation is a unique metabolic state in the body where progesterone has been high throughout the entire pregnancy because it is progestation. It is the hormone of pregnancy telling her to store energy, grow your fat cells. But the moment the baby is born, progesterone plummets. And now suddenly, and so too does insulin, now suddenly her body, those fat cells are just throwing open the doors, burning fat at such a high rate that so she naturally, even a normal woman who's breastfeeding will be in a higher state of ketosis than her husband would be, you know, if they're eating the same diet, which is not common. It's just that her body is burning so much fat now, all of a sudden, that she just has higher ketone levels naturally. There could be an evolutionary human developmental reason for this among many, including enriching her own milk with ketones, because the baby's brain thrives on ketones so much. That's a fact. The developing human requires ketones for proper brain development, which is why a chubby baby is a healthy baby, and a skinny baby will likely have learning disorders later in life. This is well documented. We want babies to be chubby because it makes ketones to feed the brain. But for her body now, if she takes the higher fat burning that naturally comes with breastfeeding and now combines that with the high fat burning that comes from a ketogenic diet, it simply increases the potential for her to get to ketoacidosis. Now, there are all kinds of women saying, well, this wasn't me. It didn't happen for me. I was fine. And my only response to that is, I'm thrilled that the person was fine. It doesn't change the fact that it can happen, and it's not rare either. So it was just me wanting to make sure people are careful with it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And, I've seen, especially in the last couple of years, there's a lot of, black or white thinking, the carnivore and keto and all of that. Yeah. And there is always nuance and context, that you have to take into account. It's not the same for everyone.
That's right.
And the second one is, because you mentioned it before, hormones in women, etc. So is there a risk of potentially overdoing it, even if you're not lactating, of doing, keto and fasting at the same time? Could that potentially disrupt your hormone levels? And I think maybe that question applies maybe in particular to women, but I think also to men, because I've noticed after 3 years of strict keto, that my thyroid levels were a little bit off. And as soon as I reintroduced carbs, they seem to have normalized. So
that's a good question. I'm glad you're bringing this up. So there's no evidence that a low carb or ketogenic diet harms the thyroid gland. None. There is evidence to show that thyroid hormones go lower, but some people will look at that and say, oh, it's damaging my thyroid gland. But I am quick to remind them, would they say the same thing when insulin comes down? So a person who is overweight and metabolically unhealthy, they have high insulin, and that's reflective of insulin resistance. And then as they start to become more metabolically healthy, their insulin levels come down. And we universally say, that's a good thing. You are becoming more insulin sensitive. Nobody says, oh, you're damaging your beta cells of your pancreas. Nobody says that, because it wouldn't be correct to say that. We are correct in saying you're becoming more insulin sensitive. Now, all of a sudden, when it comes to thyroid, we turn that all around. For some reason, we look at the lower T3 levels and we think, oh, it's because your thyroid level is damaged. And yet we don't say that with insulin. The better conclusion is to say you've become more sensitive to thyroid hormone, because just like the body can become insulin resistant, and it can become leptin resistant, it can also become thyroid resistant. This is a published phenomenon, thyroid hormone resistance. And to me, the simple and accurate conclusion is the body is simply becoming more sensitive to thyroid hormone, and thus the thyroid gland makes less of it. It does not reflect any damage to the thyroid gland whatsoever.
Interesting. That brings up another question, because and more, from a personal note, since I started a ketogenic diet, now I'm more an animal-based diet. I do eat more carbs, but I've noticed that my insulin and my fasting insulin is at 1.8 every time I test it. I test approximately every 3 months, and all the reference values I found is 2. If it's down to 2, you're fine, and nobody says anything about what if it's below 2. And I've gotten conflicting.
In my view, it just means you're super insulin sensitive. That's all it means. So I would worry that a clinician would look at that and say, oh my gosh, you're developing type 1 diabetes because your insulin is getting too low. And we know that's just not happening. It's just that you are so insulin sensitive that your beta cells are basically, they've learned, I only need to put out this much insulin and it'll get the job done, because the insulin works so well. But just to remind everybody, the beta cells will produce as much insulin as they think they need to produce in order to get the job done. Like every endocrine organ in the body, it doesn't want to produce any more than it needs. It will only produce what it considers to be the bare minimum to maintain homeostasis. All that means in you is that your body is so insulin sensitive, in very good part, Michael, probably because you have very good muscle mass, and muscle is the largest insulin sensitive organ, glucose consuming organ in the body. And so more muscle means greater potential for insulin sensitivity, and thus the beta cells can just get away with producing that much insulin.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. Well, I'm glad to know that. All right. So maybe there are 2 more areas that I'd like to cover. One is, we talked now about, the fact that, women are supposed to have more fat than men, in just genetically speaking, evolutionarily speaking, and it's important and why it's important. Now, if a woman is generally happy with their appearance, but that one area that we talked about, that that drops the fat at the last, that's the last part of the body that will shed some of that fat. Is it advisable from a health perspective to just keep going down the road of of a low carb diet, ketogenic diet, maybe caloric deficit, leveraging ketosis until that fat is gone? Or is it a better strategy from a health perspective, not from an optics or anything perspective, to just live with it?
Yeah. Well, that's a really, really good question, and I appreciate how delicate it is. The simple answer is yes, but I understand it's more complicated because she or any person, whether it was a guy or a gal, they don't want to hear that because it's troubling to them. But if for example, if a woman had fat around her belly and it was just very, very stubborn, and she's getting leaner and leaner everywhere else, I would start to say, yeah, but you have to have some fat somewhere. Right. And unfortunately, I mean, if it's in a place that's bothering the person, then boy, I mean, there's not nothing you can do. I mean, something like liposuction does in fact remove that fat, but the person just has to know that the body will now pick another spot. Right. And you don't really know where that's going to be. And it might bother you just as much or more. And then you're going to suck those fat cells out, because that's what liposuction does. And why I'm not generally an advocate of it is that it is sucking out fat cells. And that's important because, in fact, this kind of transitions into a slightly different topic, but really the root of most metabolic problem comes from fat cells undergoing hypertrophy. When the number of fat cells when the fat cells you do have are growing substantially. A healthy way to store fat, which is what women tend to naturally do more than men, is making new fat cells. And the fat cells themselves stay smaller. And so if you now have a body that is, you're going in and sucking out the fat cells, all you're doing, if the person continues to eat the way they were before and live the same life, the body's going to want to store the same amount of fat. Now it just has fewer cells in which to store that fat. And thus the remaining cells are left to pick up a larger piece of the pie, a bigger portion of the burden metabolically. And now they get bigger. And a big fat cell is pro-inflammatory and insulin resistant. And that is, in my view, what actually initiates insulin resistance in the first place. Right. It is the hypertrophic fat cell. So paradoxically, you could have a person who's going to get liposuction and they're looking leaner because they've literally sucked fat cells out of their body. And yet metabolically, they may end up worse than they were before.
Gotcha. Interesting.
So it's a hell of a trade-off. So looking good in a swimsuit, if a person's trying to get there by sucking up fat cells, it will not make them healthier. It may make them sicker.
No, okay, makes sense. And then maybe let's, I guess, switch more towards a performance-oriented view of maybe a low-carb ketogenic diet. Are there cases where relying on gluconeogenesis predominantly, the body's ability to make its own glucose from own carbohydrate sources, that becomes a problem in the long run? Like if you rely on it predominantly versus refueling your body with glucose through food, especially in the context of maybe high intensity workouts, CrossFit. I do CrossFit, and I've noticed that, and I've done like 5 to 10 net grams of carbs for 3 years or so while doing CrossFit 6 times a week. And I've noticed recovery performance in certain areas has suffered because it took my body always a little bit to, replenish those glycogen stores. And instead of just, me eating carbs. What is your take on that?
Yeah. So there, unfortunately, there are not a lot of data out on this. Professor Tim Noakes out of South Africa, he recently published a very broad review, meta-analysis, and found that his conclusion was that the predictor of performance is blood glucose levels. in that it's when blood glucose levels start to drop that performance will decline. That's when someone starts to fatigue and wear out and hit the wall, or whatever other term you want to use. But he found, interestingly, that was something that a low carb diet could actually tend to protect, because in a low carb state, the person has become so accustomed to gluconeogenesis that they're more capable of keeping that glucose level at a consistent range, the blood glucose level, as opposed to a carb dependent athlete who, the moment they start running out of their glycogen, now they don't have the capability as much to keep the glucose high by making it from lactate, and as opposed to the low carb athlete. So it was a very, very compelling work. I wish I could remember the title so everybody could go look, but it was fascinating study. Now, however, my view on people who are exercising for intensity and performance, there is probably justification for carbs. But I noticed that I'm saying probably. I'm kind of hedging my language a bit, because it's just not, there's no published report on this.
Right.
So I think it would be justified for a low carb athlete to say, when I'm going to go in and undergo this very intense workout, I'm going to eat some carbs. And I would say, you know what, good for you. You're going to those muscles are going to consume all that glucose so immediately that it will never have any lingering problem. However, we know from other human studies that for people who are just exercising to be healthy, if they eat carbs during or after the exercise, it will undo some of the insulin sensitizing effect of the exercise for the whole next day. And so it's just something to consider. I emphasize this in part because we both know, you can imagine the average middle-aged man or woman, they go exercise on the treadmill or the elliptical machine for 30 minutes or an hour, and then they go drink Gatorade or a sugary soda or a fruit smoothie, and they, metabolically speaking, they've undone the benefit. Now, there still would be a cardiopulmonary benefit, and the muscles would have been challenged. So I'm not saying the whole exercise has been undone, but if the exercise purpose was to improve insulin sensitivity, you have in fact undone some of that in at least in that short term, as long as the studies have gone out, tracking a person for the next day. And so in those instances, I think it's worth having a little more prudence in saying, okay, I'm exercising to be metabolically healthy more than big muscles and power and speed and strength. And so then I'm not going to use carbs. But for the athletes who are going for speed and strength and power, well, then I think they're much, much more justified in having carbs. And I wouldn't ever think there's going to be any metabolic deficit or problem in that case.
So when you say, okay, I go work out, and typically I work out in a fasted state, and so does my wife. And then, we come home, and then we have either right away or maybe an hour later. So we have breakfast. And usually for us, that's a high fat, high protein type of breakfast, and we reserve the carbs for later in the day. How much time do you need to leave between exercising and consuming carbs to not undo the metabolic?
Yeah, that is a very, very good question. I say very, very good because it's not been answered.
Okay.
We need to do that study.
All right, fair enough. But I think that then goes also back to the reason why the meal replacement powder or drink that you have helped develop is has a very balanced protein to fat ratio and very few carbs, for I assume exactly that reason, or at least that's one of the reasons, I suppose.
Yeah, that's right. So that's how I will end my workout. So I will, in fact, when we get done here, I will go work out. I typically am a late morning kind of guy because I have facilities right here on campus, and it's easy for me to walk down to. And there's a sauna there and the lockers and showers, of course, so it's wonderful. And so when I get back from my workout in a fasted state, I will have some Health Code shake. So Health Code was designed with that 1-to-1 by mass of protein to fat in mind, because I imagined the egg, and I look at the egg as the perfectly packaged protein fat source. It has everything you need for growth, and it is a 1-to-1 by mass. And so we focused on that, but really it was just adhering to those 3 rules: controlling carbs, making sure that the carbs are primarily fiber and not too much, and then prioritizing protein, getting the best proteins, which are always animal sourced proteins, whey and egg white, and the best fats, like olive oil, coconut oil, ghee, and matching them to the protein. Because what too few people appreciate is that, well, in nature, all protein comes with fat. There is no exception to this. None.
Mm-hmm.
There is no exception. Every protein in nature comes with fat. And that's how we should eat it. We should not pull out the fat and only eat the protein. We do not digest it as well. This is well documented. When protein is consumed with fat, it is digested better than just protein alone. And protein and fat are more anabolic, more literally stimulating more muscle protein synthesis than just protein alone. So that's how we should get it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, makes sense. All right. Let's see what else I got in my notes here that we haven't talked about yet. We could talk about, or you mentioned leptin a couple of times. Yeah. What does leptin exactly do, and what is leptin resistance, and how does that play into the whole argument?
Yeah. So leptin is a hormone that was most famous as it was originally discovered as having a role in controlling hunger and satiety. Mm-hmm. That when leptin is up, it's the fat cell's way of telling the brain, hey, we're full, we're done, stop eating. Unfortunately, just like with insulin, when leptin is too high for too long, the brain starts to become resistant to it. And it turns off that. So leptin's trying to tell the brain, hey, we're full, we're full, we're full. And yet the brain isn't getting the message. And so it keeps stimulating hunger. And it's harder for the body to get to satiety. But that's the essence of it, is that the body is swimming in a sea of leptin, and it's becoming resistant to that leptin. What's interesting to note is the interaction between leptin and insulin, because leptin is attempting to inhibit insulin. That's one of its main jobs. And that's one of the ways in which it's telling the body to be done. But however, when the body starts to become leptin resistant, the beta cells of the pancreas aren't getting that signal anymore, and they continue to release insulin. In which, of course, is going to promote more and more fat storage. So the high leptin, well, the leptin resistance rather, is stimulating greater hunger. And the higher insulin is just telling the fat cells where to put all of that energy that's coming in. So it becomes kind of a perfect storm.
So is it safe to assume that if I have very low insulin levels, then I'm not leptin resistant, or?
That's absolutely right.
Okay.
Absolutely. So I will have sometimes people will ask me, say, well, how can I measure my leptin resistance? And I'll say, don't bother. If you're insulin sensitive, you are leptin sensitive. You really can't pull those two apart.
Okay. But before we wrap it up, tell people, well, first of all, about your book.
I go buy my book.
Last year already, go buy the book. And it's actually a very good book. I read, when did it come out? Because I think I read it last year.
Yeah, it was almost 2 years ago, July. 2 years ago.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
So that's
so
a very good
it was
book.
fun. It was good timing. It was good timing, because now that the world is so obsessed with COVID and illness, a book that's called Why We Get Sick is kind of a sexy title,
That's exactly right.
It's funny because I called it that because what I wanted to call it wouldn't have worked. I wanted to call it, if I were going to be really, really accurate, the title of the book would have been, What is Insulin Resistance and Why Should You Care? But no one would ever buy it, because they would say, I don't care about insulin resistance, so I'm not going to buy the book. But that is basically the book. A lot of the conversation we've had today, in fact, is kind of encompassed in the book. But basically, it is the book on what is insulin resistance, where does it come from, why does it matter, because it matters a lot, virtually every chronic disease, and what to do about it. And we've talked a lot about the what to do about it in our time together now. But yeah, anyone who's interested, please go buy the book. Support a poor professor. You can buy it anywhere books are sold.
Cool. And maybe one more thing, because we didn't cover that at all, but just for people to maybe more appreciate why insulin is so important. It's not just because you might be obese or overweight or whatever if that part of your metabolism is out of order, but it's really one of the underlying cause, or maybe the root cause, for any metabolic disease that we might develop in the long run. Be it right? I mean, anything from cancer to diabetes, obviously, to even Alzheimer's, which I think is now called type 3 diabetes. So it's also clearly some sort of insulin resistance in the brain, and anything really in between. All the stuff that most people die from, is probably because at some point in their life they became insulin resistant, right?
Well said. Yeah, well said. That's basically the why people should care about it at all. If insulin resistance was only relevant to type 2 diabetes, and it is the foundation of it, well, then a certain number of people would care. But like you said, when you appreciate that the metabolic problems really touch every issue, whether it's heart disease, Alzheimer's, like you said, even the most common forms of infertility, the most common forms of cancer, like breast and prostate cancer, there is a profound metabolic aspect to all of these disorders. And when you start addressing the insulin resistance, you're addressing the metabolic origin. Now, I'm not claiming that insulin resistance is the only cause of these. No, but it is a common cause of all of them. And so why not address this one problem and thereby lower your risk of all those other problems? It only makes sense.
Yeah. And maybe also, I think an important consideration, just because you're not overweight doesn't necessarily mean you're metabolically healthy.
That's right.
Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely. This is well documented that the way people store fat differently, and someone may have less overall fat on their body, but bigger fat cells. And remember, it's not the number of fat cells or the amount of fat that matters. It's the size of the individual fat cells that matter.
Right. Okay, good point. And then maybe one last thing, because it just popped into my head as well. We talked about carbohydrates, right? And how the body, might convert it and store it as fat, etc. But there is right now a discussion going on between, is it really the carbs that cause insulin resistance and metabolic problems, or is it seed oils? Polyunsaturated fatty acid, or is it both maybe? What is your take on that?
My take is that I know for 100% certainty that elevated insulin itself can cause insulin resistance. This has been published. We have published that in cells. We have published that in rodents, and others have published that in humans. That when you increase the insulin in a human, they become insulin resistant. So do the rodents, so do the cells. And that is totally independent of anything with linoleic acid from seed oils. However, linoleic acid from seed oils can accumulate in a fat cell, forcing a fat cell to grow through hypertrophy. And now we've come back to the fat cell. So there's no question in my mind that linoleic acid can contribute to insulin resistance, if only perhaps indirectly by stimulating the growth of the fat cell in a harmful way. Whereas insulin can do it directly at any cell of the body. So these are both relevant. No question. I'm not saying that seed oils are not relevant. They absolutely are. But and I think seed oil, linoleic acid, is massively problematic in a whole host of issues, of disorders. But strictly with regards to insulin resistance, the chronically elevated insulin is very well documented. Now, perhaps more and more evidence is going to be supporting linoleic acid and prove it out in all three of these biomedical models that I mentioned: cells, rodents, humans. But at the moment, I know for a fact, chronically elevated insulin will cause insulin resistance independent of any amount of seed oil. But of course, in our modern environment, we have tossed them together.
Right? Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. Cool. All right. So we talked about the book. Where can people else find you? I follow you on Instagram. I really enjoy the videos you put out, which bits and pieces of very good information. So they can find you on Instagram. What's your handle? I'm going to put it down then in the description as well. But just if you want to spell it out.
Yeah, of course. Yes. Thanks.
Bikman,
so
MD.
Ben Bikman, PhD.
PhD. That's right.
Yeah, Ben Bikman, PhD. And just remember, no C, everybody. No C in Bikman, just Bikman. But my involvement is mostly on Instagram, where it's just more of a friendly environment than Twitter is these days. But in general, I just try to put out little kind of 1-minute tidbits on human metabolism, really kind of digestible information. It's not pictures, it's not me, not my personal life. It's just, here's a little bit about nutrient metabolism and human metabolism.
Right. Cool. And I'm going to link the book down below as well. I'm going to link your page, the Health Code supplement. So if people want to, find a decent, very good post-workout supplement instead of loading up on sugary drinks and whatnot, they can take that and get their right amounts of protein and fat with very few carbs. I'm going to link down that below as well. And yeah, I think with that, we're going to wrap it up. I very much appreciate your time. It was great information.
My pleasure. My pleasure. This was a great conversation. I hope everyone goes back, listen to it again if you have to. We covered some great stuff. Yeah.
Very nice. All right. Thank you very much. I'll let you go work out now.
Yeah, that's right. Yep. Time to get jacked.
I have to do it too. Yeah, that's right.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Michael.
man. I appreciate it. Bye.
Yep. See ya.